I had promised right before the break that we would talk about the final project and then never did. So I'm going to start with that today, remind you what the project is about, and then, of course, answer any questions, even the most basic, you may have about it. For the second part of the class, I will go back to the Godfather Part II and analyze 2 or 3 sequences depending on what time we have left. I'll talk about the book, the last one, at a later point. I'm the co-organizer of a conference of philosophy, Italian philosophy on campus, so I came straight from the conference. I didn't dress up for you. And I'll go back there once I'm done. Okay? So my idea of the project was that it would be the extension of the assignments, that the assignments would prepare you for the work for the final project. I'm calling it my idea because the most common feedback that I find myself adding to my comments when I read your assignments is incorporate more details from the scenes. Talk more about a few specific scenes where this theme is represented and articulated throughout the movie, throughout the arc of a character. In other words, I'm not expecting a traditional paper on a film. Whatever film you pick, and we'll get into this also, this matter of what film should I use. No matter what film you use, I'm not expecting you to start with a boring paragraph, famous film that came out in the year blah blah blah, directed by so and so, followed by some kind of high school thesis for your paper that you then develop. I'm not expecting you to provide a comprehensive examination of a film review. No, you should be selective and strategic, and the most important thing, in my mind, would be after you've selected a film, start with an element, a character, a scene, a sequence that speaks to you, that provides the strongest evidence for the argument or the theme that you want to develop. In the case of the project, you know how the assignments are supposed to cover a list of topics organized by in a dual format: influence and manipulation, violence and deterrence, competition and cooperation. So they're either connected or they're opposites. And so before the end of the semester, you have to write one essay about each of these topics. In the case of the project, the final project on a film, it's up to you to pick themes that would be appropriate for that film. As long as you keep yourself aligned with the class, rather than providing some generic analysis of the film. But I see also a danger, the risk would be to force a film into, or force your reading, your interpretation of the film into the so-called Machiavellian schema that I posted online. It might not work entirely depending on the film, but as long as you move along those lines, meaning if we watch a film and analyze it from the point of view, first of all, the point of view of leadership. What model of leadership is conveyed through this film, through one or more characters in this film, then to what extent is this model of leadership Machiavellian? And if the character is rising to power, or rising to power and then failing, what are, in the film, according to the film, the key elements of the character's success? What makes the character successful in their business, even if it might be criminal kind of business? What makes them fail if they fail, right? So, in a more mechanical view of the film, what is the plan that takes, or the strategy that takes the character to a position of increased power? What are the mechanical elements that determine the undoing of the character? And then we're all aware of the fact that there will be other elements, there will be more emotions, because films tend to be more dramatic or more emotional than, for example, The Prince by Machiavelli. There will be other elements because the dimension of a character on the screen may have aspects that are integrated or partially integrated that go beyond their leadership. So don't force this model onto the film, but use the Machiavellian schema or some elements of it as a filter, right? So you won't be talking about the whole film. And depending on the film, you might not even be talking about the whole arc of a character. However, keep in mind the most important thing is to build the paper from the ground up. The ground is the scenes. And the scenes, keeping in mind the classic definition of a cinema studies class, the mise en scène. The mise en scène is the mix of all the elements in a scene. That is to say, how the character moves in the scene physically, how the actor uses their body in the scene, what is on the stage, right, on the set in that scene, because even the background, the surrounding space defines the character, what is being done in the scene, what is being said in the scene. But even there, it's not just words, right, because it depends on how you say things. You say them slowly or aggressively, you say them emphatically or with a dramatic tone, intonation, right? So how do the elements in a selection, a sample of scenes from the movie produce an effect on the viewer built in with the mix of those elements a model of leadership? For example, by suggesting that whoever is the criminal in the film, he's not just a savage beast who's inclined to use violence, shoot first and speak later, but rather someone who is endowed with leadership skills that you can imagine applicable to other fields of society, and perhaps, as it was Mario Puzo's fixation, conviction, circumstances dictated that this character ended up working in a criminal organization because there were no other venues for their human, social, business-like qualities, and therefore the leadership they manifested was targeting criminal activities rather than the growth in sales at a corporation, the development of the iPhone, etc. Okay, so once you keep in mind these elements, you have the keys to make the project your own, and certainly the first thing would be to pick a film that you want to work on, a film that makes you ask questions, right? And then you're trying to articulate an answer, but don't rush to conclusion, right? That's often an issue for students in general, because the important thing is not the answer. This is not a math problem, but rather how you get there. And therefore, for a film, how is the theme articulated? Because from one scene at the beginning of the film to another, there might be a nuanced development of the same theme, right? So you offer a partial examination of a theme or two in a film with adding complexity and depth to your discussion and supporting your discussion with examples rather than starting with generalities, with generic statements, and then referring as an afterthought, referring to a scene, right? So when you build from the scenes and you're trying to develop an articulated argument, then you find that there are elements that can be contradictory, or elements that push in slightly different directions, but sometimes those are the elements that make a movie successful, because the worst movies are templated movies, right? And you have all sorts of examples that you can think of, right? Because exactly based on a template, you could shoot a film in a week, as the what is it, Oxygen Channel will do those easy romance films, and then all the way to the 9 months that it took Coppola to shoot Godfather Part II because of the complex element, or the even longer time that it took him to shoot Apocalypse Now, right? Okay, so those are the ideas, the principles for the project that I want you to keep in mind. I'll show you again the list of films before I stop, and then answer your questions about this, or your ideas, whatever you're working on. So, of course, I should mention the presentation. So, the last week of the semester, I want each student to briefly present on their project. It doesn't mean that you have to have the project finished. The presentation could be based on one brief scene that you have already analyzed, that is part of the collection of relevant material of evidence to build your project. So one way, doesn't mean that this should be the only format, but one way to deliver a successful presentation would be to show 2 minutes from the film, 3 minutes at the top, because you have no more than 8 to 10 minutes for your presentation in class, and then explain what the scene is communicating. It doesn't have to be done that way. In fact, if you're able to, you can just take individual frames from the scene, put them as pictures on the screen so that you can take the scene apart, unpack the style of the film, showing the elements that the frame includes. Okay? So the presentation, again, is not supposed to be you reading a boring PowerPoint. Nobody wants that now. Nobody will want that from you when you find a job, right? You need to have a story. You need to have something interesting to say, and it's a short presentation. Again, not the summary of your project. And at that point, probably very few of you might have a finished project. But it's showing that you are on your way to building a successful project because you're able to present some of the evidence to support some of the arguments that will be included in your project. Clearly, you may want to include a very short summary of the film if it is not a film that people would be familiar with, but again, it should be 30 seconds, right? The traditional Hollywood format, which is tell me your screenplay in 25 words or less. A little more than that, but not a long description of the film. You might have to, if you're showing a scene, you might have to place the scene in the story, right? Because just getting your audience cold into the scene might only generate perplexity. So you might need to set the scene you're showing, and then you proceed with a brief analysis of key points. Don't worry about format, meaning you need an intro, you don't need a conclusion where you summarize your points, because if you are presenting for 10 minutes, people will remember the points you just introduced, right? So there too, for the presentation, be selective. Choose something that is interesting, exciting, that provides strong evidence for the initial development of an argument, present the scene, comment on the scene, expose some ideas that you're planning to develop, and that's it. And then your final project, the final paper that you submit a few days after the end of the semester, will have more pieces, right? Will have some formality to it, right? But you don't have to make the presentation an exact double of your project, okay? Keep in mind there are two different formats. They have two different learning goals. As a teacher, for me, the learning goal of the presentation is to make sure that you've learned enough to use the proper language to talk about criminal leadership in a film, right? And in order to show that, again, you cannot be reading from a PowerPoint. I hope you can read. And I'll be reading your projects, your papers. The presentation is about something else. And if you forget something, and you stop, and you go back, and you add something, that's life. That's speaking in real life, right? Because this is not a TV set. You don't have producers. You don't have people with big cardboards with everything you need to say. So it's natural that you might deviate a little, go back to something. You don't have to fret about the formality of your delivery. That's not how the assessment of this component of the class will go, right? It's the content, it's your mastery of the language, so that you're speaking a language that is clear and convincing, right? That those are the basic communicative skills applicable to any place. Finally, as promised, so I provided a list with some links and information, right? It's about eight films. Because my idea was, if you want to do something similar to what we've done in class, you don't have to repeat what I've done with The Godfather, or work on a film such as The Godfather, on which you already find 10,000 articles, right? And therefore you might end up with something imitative, generic, because of that. My idea was, let's go and pick a film lesser known in this genre with slightly different elements, right? So that you can be more creative, not just apply step by step this recipe that I'm giving you. And these are films that came to mind. In fact, just the other day I was listening to Michael Francis. By the way, be creative with your sources. I was listening to a video by a former member of the mafia of Cosa Nostra. 3 generations, the third generation of family of members of the mafia. His grandfather was in it, his father was in it, he himself spent, 20 years in prison. And he was giving a reading of various films, and one of them was a film about Gotti that might be added there. So the list is not exhaustive. And I'm pretty open to suggestions. I would recommend that if you want to focus your paper on a film that is not on the list, that you at least send me the title with a simple question: is it okay if I work on this film? And perhaps if the choice is not, the reasons for the choice are not immediately apparent, you can add two lines to say, I would like to work on this film for these reasons, or say, I know that this is not an exact match to the films that we've seen in class, but I have this reason or that reason to do that. I would be fine with that. Ultimately, even if you were to work with one or more of the films that we shown in class, I'd be fine as long as you don't give me something repetitive, right? As long as you find an innovative angle. Let's say The Godfather, but you have this idea that has not been tried. You want to focus on a specific aspect of Godfather Part I or Part II that you think would be fertile, would produce great fruit. I would be fine with that, right? The reason I created the list was that I wouldn't get just a regurgitation of the stuff you've heard in class, but you would be able to make the project your own. And hence also the idea, if you have another film in mind or a TV series, some people have mentioned The Soprano. If you pick a TV series, just keep in mind that you cannot hand a paper on the whole TV series, right? It would be just a catalog. For a TV series, I would say focus on one episode, maybe 2 episodes, right? Again, you don't have to talk about the character throughout, the character played by Gandolfini, Tony Soprano, throughout the whole series, but you might simply set up the episode the same way I suggested you set up a scene, saying, this is where we are in the arc of the series. So, in order to understand this episode, keep this in mind, as if you were talking to an average reader who hasn't seen the whole series. And then you can develop your analysis of the scene in the episode, or how the episode is built, or these 2 episodes, if the story, this segment of the story is built across 2 or 3 episodes, and you follow that narrative pattern, but you can narrow your focus, right? Again, this is also something that throughout my career at Stony Brook I've seen a lot of, that students have grandiose projects that are too big to manage for a single paper. And the paper seems impossible because you've set impossible goals for yourself. Whereas if you define your topic more narrowly, then you can scale it down to something that is manageable, that you can do without taking a full year or 3 months to complete. I added links so that you can find, if it is on Amazon, because a lot of people or their parents or their friends have Amazon Prime, and I always included the link to justwatch.com to show where else you can find the film. And some of these films might be available at this library, at a local library, etc. Right? So, for example, The Day of the Owl is about the owl. Il giorno della civetta is based on a Sicilian novel by Leonardo Sciascia, and is filmed from 1968 about the Sicilian mafia, about this police officer who gets into this town, has this new assignment, assigned to this post, and is socializing at the same time investigating, coming to know the people in the town, coming to know the criminals in the town, and then those things merge more and more, and he finds himself playing a game based, once again, on violence or the threat of violence thrown at people around him and thrown at him. And he's also realizing how rooted in the local community the operations of the local mafia chiefs are, right? So different in some ways from the films we've seen, but still manageable in terms of analysis using the models that I've introduced in this class, etc. And then you can go into the list. There is one that I felt obliged to add, but it's more difficult to find, and that's the second film, the Valachi papers. In fact, they're indirect references to this film in The Godfather Part II. But it's all right, okay? And again, if you have other films in mind, films you'd rather work with, just let me know to make sure that you're not going completely off the path, picking Snow White or something like that. Although anything, including a fairy tale, can be analyzed from a Machiavellian standpoint, but okay. So that was the end of my spiel about the final project and the other aspect, the presentation, and I'm here until needed to answer your questions before we move to the discussion of one or more additional scenes from Godfather Part II. And again, if you came in a little late, since I started talking about the project, the second minute of this hour, know that you have the video that'll be posted by the end of the week on YouTube and the class wiki, and you can recover the 5 or 10 minutes you lost. Or in May, you can go back and see, let me see before working on the project, what he had to say about the project itself. And otherwise, any question is welcome, from the most basic to the most complicated, okay? Or suggestions of ideas. If you have an idea and you feel comfortable saying, my plan is to work on this and I want to do it this way, of course I can engage in that kind of discussion, provide feedback on your initial idea, on the seed that you're planting for your project. So you have the floor. What say you? Yes, Liz?
So I was thinking of doing a storyline from The Sopranos. I had two ideas. So I was thinking either, I can't remember his name, I have to go back and look, but Meadows' first college boyfriend and the demise of him. I don't know if that rings a bell, but it...
That would be like a Jeopardy question,
Yeah.
and I would fail for 10 seconds.
I can go back and
go ahead, yeah.
And then, the killing of Chrissy, where like no one expected Tony to kill him. But those are each like 2 or 3 episodes each. Would that be okay?
I would say only pick one of them rather than both.
No.
I'm only
picking one.
Okay.
Just I'm saying each.
Yeah, that's the idea, exactly.
Okay.
2 or 3 episodes, and clearly within those episodes there will be other threads.
Yeah.
But if you intend to analyze the steps, the elements in the story that led to this development, use that to filter out the narrative noise. Don't feel obliged to include references unless the other threads are somewhat echoing the main story or are related in a visual, in a thematic way, but otherwise keep your eye on the target and selectively extract the scenes from those 2 or 3 episodes, and that you can use either to describe the story or for some of the moments, some of the sequences, enter into the analysis of the story. But that would be fine. That would be exactly what I had in mind in case you picked a TV series.
Okay.
Yeah. And of course, don't try to match my expectations. When it comes to examples, as long as you can develop a strong argument, and again, as long as you're not talking about something completely foreign to the class, you'll be fine. Use what speaks to your mind and to your heart. That is to say, an episode that piques your interest, that you would enjoy unpacking to show the intricacies of that episode. Because as far as myself, I don't have one model paper that I'm measuring your product against. Okay? I'm just hoping to find a convincing analysis based on specific details that are not limited to actions and words, lines and gestures, but possibly would include the other elements that in a film or a TV series one uses to amplify the effects of a story. Okay? Other ideas and questions? Are you silent because you don't need me, or because you feel suicidal thinking about the project and you think, I don't know, maybe I'll win the mega millions and I won't have to write this paper before the end of the semester? Yeah, come
Okay,
again.
the second question, it
Of
was like
course.
my backup idea. Are we watching Goodfellas in this class?
Yes, yes,
Okay,
yeah, we're getting there. We'll
Okay,
get there.
never mind, that's my backup idea.
And don't interrupt me. But again, as I said, even though I think it would be ideal to go with another film, I'm not completely opposed in principle to the idea of using a film. So if you have a good idea about Goodfellas, I would be okay with you picking that film as long as you don't just replicate what the discussions in class. And I don't think I have 2 weeks on Goodfellas, so my discussion will be limited. So it's a film that offers plenty of other opportunities, so keep that in mind.
It's like
if you'd rather work on Goodfellas,
it's like a plan C if I don't get anywhere with Sopranos, you know?
Yeah. Okay. And in case, again, it's nice to work on a TV series, especially if you're familiar with it. But otherwise, if you're not, it becomes too complicated. In many ways, more complicated than film. So you have to be comfortable with the material. What else? Come on. Of course, this doesn't have to be the only time we talk about the project. At the same time, you should be proactive. We're not too many weeks away from the end of the semester, about a month. So even if I'm not reminding you of the project at the beginning of any class, you can ask me to stop and spend some time answering questions about the project. And of course, you can visit me during office hours or schedule a Zoom meeting. And if my office hours don't work for you, let me know, because usually I'm here from 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning until 6 or 7 p.m. every day. So unless I have a meeting in my agenda, I can devote some time to you. You have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna say, for the final paper, is it like required, like maybe like 5 pages? I don't know if you went over that.
2,000 to 3,000 words, right?
Oh, 3,000
Including
words.
quotes.
Okay.
It's in the syllabus.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was
And
taking notes, that's what.
any format when it comes to notes or works cited, any format you're familiar with would work, right? You have to know what your background is, but if you know how to do the citations in the MLA or Chicago style or ABA, anything would do, as long as you have a standard, right? It's not just your interpretation of what a cited source should be. Anything else? So don't hesitate if you are struggling with the choice of a film, if you have a film in mind but you're not sure whether it might be acceptable to use, just let me know, okay? In class, outside of class, that would be fine. Oh, by the way, and keep working on your assignments, right? You have to complete the 4 topics before the end of the semester. I was hoping to get more progress on that. And keep in mind, I'll routinely go and open the files, but if you want me to move more quickly, add a comment whenever you add a comment to an assignment in Google Docs, such as, I'm done with an assignment, you can go ahead and review it. I'll receive a notification in my Gmail inbox, and so I can do that more quickly. Okay, so we have enough time for two, probably three sequences of the Godfather Part II. And the first one is placed within the context of Michael's trip to Cuba. Remember, it's 1958. Michael is in business with Hyman Roth, whose character is based on a real-life gangster who lived mostly in Florida towards the end of his life, but had worked in New York City at the beginning of his life. In the story, Hyman Roth was himself just a truck driver in the early 1920s who connected with Vito Corleone, Michael's father, and that because of his trucks was able to work with him bootlegging the alcohol during Prohibition, right, and make money that way, like many others did, including, for example, Joe Kennedy, right, the father of President Kennedy, was heavily involved in trafficking alcohol during Prohibition. So it is historically accurate that Cuba during the 1950s presented an interesting Machiavellian situation where various criminal organizations, including the mafia, were able to infiltrate the island with the blessing and sometimes the support of the government, which was a dictatorial government before Fidel Castro instituted a Marxist dictatorship with the backing of the Soviet Union, right? And you're, of course, too young, but maybe your parents might have seen, I don't know, or your grandparents might have lived through the crisis of 1963, the Cuba crisis that brought the world close to the third global conflict. But the dictator of Cuba was in business with the mafia and other organizations. They were allowed to invest money in hotels and casinos, and the government would take bribes, right? Would take a cut of their profits. They were doing running some criminal activities, right? Some drug, even though the mafiosi would always say we didn't do drugs. Even Michael Francesi that I was listening to on the YouTube yesterday was saying in this video, never do drug. We were always told never to drug. That was a no-no. They were doing that on the side all the time. And even the capos who were saying the soldiers don't traffic in drugs were doing it. So that's part of the mafia lore. But my point is that in Cuba, the focus of the business, the activities of these criminal organizations was not crime itself. Their problem was then, and still is now, that they have rooms full of cash, right? And it was still possible. Some of those people actually went to banks with suitcases full of notes on a weekly basis, and the bank directors closed an eye and counted the money and deposited it in the accounts. But it was risky, right? You can only do that for a while. Being able to build or purchase hotels and casinos, having an operation like a casino where a lot of cash is exchanged, allow them to launder their money, to make their money into legitimate profit. Don't forget that even Capone went to jail because of IRS issues, right? Violations of the tax code, because they couldn't pin any crime on him. So, in the story, Michael is invited by Hyman Roth to invest in more hotels and casinos. And in fact, at some point, Fredo will travel with $2 million in cash, which in 1958 was a huge amount, to fund his participation, his membership in this. But what I'm interested in in this part of the film is yet another boardroom meeting kind of scene. This time only, it's not just mafiosi sitting around the table. At the head of the table, in fact, you have Batista, the dictator of Cuba, who was about to be ousted by Fidel Castro's soldiers. And around the table, an interesting mix of businessmen from legitimate American companies investing in Cuba's infrastructure and mafiosi. And the significance of the scene is just to represent the idea that was very strong in Mario Puzo, that leaders are leaders, that some leaders became mafiosi, some leaders became heads of companies, but they share the same skills, and the mafiosi could have been legitimate entrepreneurs, and the CEOs, the managers of the American companies, were probably as criminally inclined as the mafiosi, right? That there is a shared model of leadership that is both clean and dirty on the side of the mafia, on the side of the American companies. Okay, it's not a long scene. We are watching it because, if you remember, if you've been here every time, we've seen two similar sequences, setups. One was 1967, the film The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the meeting of Capone with all his top-level accomplices, all very stiffly seated, very symmetrically placed around this big table. The second scene in this kind of trope was Vito Corleone meeting with the representatives of the five families and others from other states to discuss the safe return, to negotiate the safe return of Michael. There, less symmetry, people are not as stiff, there are more ethnic elements, less businesslike, and so you can compare those two scenes to this, and we're still within the same theme and trope. Why is he responding to that? Because later on there will be a dialogue with a reference to this episode. Michael's reading of the situation as someone who's about to invest $2 million in a local hotel and casino is the revolution in Cuba might actually win, bring down the government, because people are voluntarily sacrificing their lives. So this guy, rather than being arrested, takes a hand grenade, goes to the captain, the officer of that platoon, to kill himself and the Cuban police officer, right? So he's saying if people are voluntarily complying with Fidel Castro's orders, then the leadership of Fidel Castro is stronger than the leadership of Batista, because Batista bases his leadership on bribes. Getting bribes, giving privileges in exchange for bribes. So, as such, he cannot be a strong leader. Are people willing to sacrifice their lives for Batista? Of course not. Hence, Fidel Castro has more of a chance to succeed. Therefore, I shouldn't be committing money to an island. In fact, it is true that by 1962 or 63, all the people, especially the various criminal organizations that had invested money in Cuba, had to abandon their operations and lost millions of dollars, right? As Cuba was unified under Castro, and Castro implemented this perfect utopian Marxist society in Cuba. Okay? The following scene, we can go on a little bit. So, again, maybe I should remind you, in case you don't remember, that there is one chapter in The Prince where Machiavelli insists that one of the foundational elements of leadership is knowledge, the ability to read the geography, and the other elements in the physical context in which the prince is operating. And this is what Michael is doing. Approaching this without emotions, in a very objective and neutral way to assess the feasibility of this operation. The next scene is about playing games, and therefore it's not about force, violence, deterrence. It's more about manipulation, which is a form of influence. Hyman Roth, sitting here, is manipulating Michael and the other by using misinformation about his disease, right? Michael later on will say, he's been dying from the same heart attack for the past 20 years, right? I'm thinking of colleagues in the past who seemed to be retiring, and then it seemed like they had been promising to retire for 20 years, but never did. I don't know if you've encountered these very old professors. Before COVID, they were more frequent on this campus. So, by pretending to be very sick, on the verge of retiring from his business, pretending to play the game of father to son with Michael, Michael will be my successor, I will hand my business to him in exchange for money and protection of my allies. By doing this game, engaging in this game, Hyman Roth is manipulating Michael. Michael himself, playing along, is reciprocating this kind of game, right? Because Michael knows that by this point, he's almost sure, and then in just 20 minutes of film, he'll be completely sure that Hyman Roth was the one who used Fredo to attack the compound in Lake Tahoe at the beginning of the film, when Michael is in his bedroom, his wife Kay is in the bed, ready to fall asleep, and then they shoot him at them through the windows. So he is already engaging in an indirect competition or war with Hyman, pretending to go along with him. At the same time, Michael is playing the part of the leader differently from Vito, because you should compare this scene to the way Vito handles Sollozzo in The Godfather. Vito, which is played by Marlon Brando quite differently, is always jovial, never harsh, always polite, well-mannered, like a businessman should be, right? Saying, yeah, Mr. Sollozzo, I'm saying no to your business, I'm not giving you my judges, my connections with the police to protect your drug trafficking business, but is gracious. Whereas Michael as a character and Al Pacino as the actor playing that character are harsher, are not as agreeable with others. So even while Michael is pretending to accept the version of the story provided by Hyman Roth, he'll retire, hand over the business to Michael, it's not very believable, right? It's cold. So, especially for somebody with an Italian background, you would expect them to be more sociable, whereas Michael is through the movie playing Pacino is through the whole movie, playing the part of Michael in a very steely way, right? I'm talking about nuances, okay? I'm trying to direct you to notice the nuances, right? It's not so harsh, but it's visible that it's not playing along in the most convincing way. This is the end of a scene where the landlord, whose tenant is being helped by Vito Corleone. So we see Vito's social skills that are not the same as Michael's. Michael is more self-centered. From there we go to the next scene where Michael is called to testify in front of a governmental public hearing committee to talk about his activities. Keep in mind that these hearings actually took place multiple times during the 1960s and 70s, and most of the actual mafiosi called in to respond would just plead the Fifth, invoke the Fifth Amendment, refuse to respond on grounds that their response might incriminate them. Sometimes they were threatened with contempt of court, but mostly they did that. Instead, we see Michael responding. He's trying to use his influence. He's trying to show that he has nothing to fear, that he's an upstanding citizen of the community, and that is being bad-mouthed by the others, right? He's not a mafioso. How did they do it? What's the end game bringing the brother there? What are they communicating to the witness? Chris, what do you think?
Saying we're going to kill your family if you.
It's more subtle than that.
Yeah.
It's more subtle than that. And that's the beauty of this. It's both a vague threat, your family may pay the consequences of your testifying, but it's also bringing in a symbol of the honor system of the mafia. Meaning, you'll save yourself from jail by testifying against Michael, but your family may pay physically, but first of all, you've dishonored your family. You've acted against the values that are represented by your older brother, so you're disappointing him. Then you can think you're also exposing him to the possibility of a murder, being murdered by Corleone. So the first thing in here is bringing back the very Sicilian value of honor. You're shaming your family because one of the strongest core values of mafia organization is you don't talk to the police, you don't collaborate with the police. Whatever you do, that's the only thing that makes you less than a man, right? And in their culture, this is a big thing. And that's why, in the end, Frank Pentangeli will kill himself by cutting his veins in a bathtub like the opponents of Nero of the Roman emperors.